Okay, sure.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for this kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. The topic that we're discussing here sounds very interesting to me. So what I will try to do is to give you my perspective on it. That is, of course, based on the work that I do here with the World Bank. When I think of the title of today's lecture, I see a curvy, bumpy, and a long road. The road that I see may not be a short road than some people seem to see or are saying could be the road that could be traveled in a relatively short time. Nevertheless, I think it's a journey that could be completed, but it would take a lot of courage, patience, and it would take a significant amount of time. So to help you understand my vision of this road, let me give you a snapshot of the Palestinian economy today. And let me also discuss how the economy of what we see today has evolved between Oslo and present. So as the title indicates, and as Dan had already discussed, sustainable is definitely not the right word to describe the Palestinian economy today. This becomes very obvious when one looks at the fiscal and external accounts of the Palestinian economy. The Palestinian Authority's budget deficit amounts to about that's projected $1.1 billion only to cover recurrent expenditures. This is roughly 9–10% of GDP. And most of the financing for this deficit relies upon inflows of donor aid, most of it on grant basis. While the size of this deficit is very large, one also has to recognize that in relative terms, it has improved remarkably, actually, dropping from 24% of GDP in 2009 to now 10% of GDP. And this was largely accomplished through measures to contain growth of expenditures by the Palestinian Authority. Revenues have not increased as one would have expected over this period of time. So this reduction was basically rendered necessary as a result of reductions also in the amount of foreign aid in recent years, which has dropped from a peak of 1.8 billion in 2008 to only 0.8 billion in 2012. The expansion of the public sector, actually, over the past years has had some good impact. It has also enabled the expansion in the provision of public services by the Palestinian Authority. And I'll give you some examples. For instance, the Palestinian Authority manages a social safety net that's on par with some of the best that we are seeing in developing countries all over the world. It has had also this has had positive impact on poverty. The poverty rate has dropped from 32% in 2007 to 22%. This is a 10% drop in only 3 years. Education system also seems to be continually improving, and there's near universal enrollment in school. And child mortality, for instance, is on par with developed countries, and it's about the same as it is in the United States. Of course, not all of these outcomes can be attributed entirely to public expenditures, but there is no doubt that an increase in public spending and increased attention to the provision of public services by the PA has played a role in this. And also expanded public sector has been an important, in the absence of private sector growth, has been an important driver of growth, however unsustainable this is. So, of course, this is all very nice, but donors seem to be getting exhausted of providing budget support indefinitely without an end in sight. The level of aid has dropped substantially, as I said, since its 2008 peak. And we saw what happened last year when the level of donor aid dropped more rapidly than the Palestinian Authority expected. They started experiencing a real budget crisis towards the end of last year. There were a couple of factors that played to that. Israel also suspended revenue payments in December, and in January this was resumed. Of course, later there were also some advance payments before that. But all this uncertainty has had a negative impact on the financing of the Palestinian Authority. So, given the indispensability of aid in driving growth in recent years, its relative reduction is also being manifested in the rates of growth, and we are seeing a drop in the rates of growth from about 10%, what we were seeing in recent years, to less than 6%, 5.9% last year is the preliminary estimates, and this could drop to about 5% this year. While this is good growth for many countries, given the growth of the population in Palestine, this is not enough to put a dent in unemployment. Actually, unemployment has started going up, and it's relatively high, at 24%, and in particular, it's worse in Gaza. So, if this trend continued, consequences could be very seriously negative. And the initiative that the peace initiative comes at the right time. But an important question is, how successful can this initiative be, and how successful can the promise of this initiative to increase GDP in 3 years by basically bringing investments that amount to $4 billion. I don't know how these amounts have been arrived at, to be honest.
Nobody knows from what I hear.
Yeah. I've been trying to find out, but I don't know. So I will argue basically that $4 billion in investment, which we still don't know where it would go or how it can be implemented, cannot do much in the absence of very drastic changes in the business environment for Palestine. If financing, for instance, was the most binding constraint to private sector growth, we would be seeing a different picture on the balance sheets of commercial banks that the Palestinian Monetary Authority oversees. What we are currently seeing is very low ratio of loans to deposits of about 50%. On top of that, about half of those loans are extended either to the Palestinian Authority or to employees of the Palestinian Authority. This is telling us that banks are sitting on cash and there are very few business opportunities to place it. In addition to bank balances, on a daily basis almost, we speak with different investors who are telling that their main problem is the identification of profitable investments. So money alone does not seem to be really the most binding constraint on growth. So when one speaks about poor business environment, one is speaking about high perceived risk to investment and oftentimes prohibitively high costs of doing business. So, for instance, growth of the tradable sector, which ought to be the driver of sustainable growth. It's particularly constrained. It's hard fact that no small economy has managed to develop on a sustainable basis and grow for a long period of time without boosting its exports. But we see that there was very little export growth since Oslo and today. To the contrary, actually, we have seen between Oslo and now almost a complete deindustrialization of West Bank and Gaza, with severe drops of productivity in both agriculture and manufacturing. For instance, agriculture share in GDP has dropped drastically from almost 15% of GDP to about 6% of GDP now. This is not too, this happens when countries develop, but also the labor force in agriculture drops. And something very different has happened in the case of the Palestinian economy. Actually, the number of workers working in agriculture sector has almost doubled when the relative share of output was halved. So this tells us more about the lack of opportunities of people to work elsewhere. So with this lack of opportunity, they move to agriculture, basically subsistence agriculture, which provides them with means of survival. And we see a very similar story with manufacturing, which has dropped its size has dropped as a share of GDP in this time. And exports of goods have hovered about 10% of GDP, 15% with the exports of services. This is among the lowest shares that we are seeing anywhere in the world. So the productive base of the Palestinian economy has definitely been eroded. So there's ample evidence, actually, that the growth of the tradable sector is constrained by various restrictions which are imposed by the government of Israel on the account of security. For instance, exporting anything out of Gaza has become very difficult, and there has been virtually no trade between West Bank and Gaza and Israel. The situation is somewhat better in West Bank, but various restrictions really pose binding constraints on growth of exports and import competing industries. For instance, specifically, internal checkpoints pose mobility restrictions to both goods and labor. There was a paper recently published by World Bank, a research paper, which put only the cost of restrictions to movement on labor at about 7% of GDP. This is very high. The cost of exporting is also very high. There are very rigorous security procedures which add to the cost, and they also increase, of course, the time of trade to complete a trade transaction. Palestinian traders often have to rely on Israeli importers, and this has been documented in a number of World Bank studies, to import different inputs for production. And one of the assessments that the World Bank conducted showed that as a result of this, basically, the price of imported inputs is about 20 to 25% higher than the international price of those goods. There's also an extensive dual-use goods list which prohibits imports of certain important raw materials which are relevant for, in particular, metal processing sectors, agriculture sector. Restrictions on almost any economic activity in Area C, where many resources for the economy lie, is also very important. For instance, there's significant potential for development of tourism along the Dead Sea, the development of mineral industry along the Dead Sea, but this is not possible because economic activity or construction is not allowed in Area C. There are numerous other indirect effects, in particular on the construction sector. Prices of housing are very high because space for the expansion of permanent structures is very limited. So all of these varied constraints have a significant effect on the cost of doing this business and negatively affect the profitability of doing business. And they add to the political insecurity, which of course is an important source of risk for investors. So in my view, without broad-based removal of these restrictions, it would be very difficult to see that investments would be willing to invest in West Bank and Gaza, and that many sustainable investments could be identified. Investments perhaps could serve as a confidence-building measure that could help the removal of these security restrictions. And they could be a part of a broader strategy, but a growth strategy that does not really include the removal of these restrictions on a very broad basis would most likely not be sustainable. So this is basically my views on the title, on today's the topic of today's discussions.
Thank you very much, Orhan. I'll just add to that something that was brought to light during President Obama's visit. Palestine doesn't have any 3G.
That's correct.
Palestine does not have third-generation cellular capabilities, so smartphones they cannot have, which means that developing an IT sector that is developing applications for smartphones that can then be very attractive for the entire Arab market and as well as the global market if they come up with the next I don't know, Get Taxi or Waze or whatever, is also not possible. So that is a policy matter. I can assure you that it is not a security matter. I had a long discussion about this with the Director General of the Israeli Ministry for Communications. It's much more a power play between the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. But here you have a policy issue that is inhibiting growth and inhibiting the development of the Palestinian IT sector, just for example.
I mean, there's another dimension of this. 3G services are currently provided, can be accessed in the West Bank through Israeli providers. And this, of course, people who want to have 3G will purchase it from Israeli providers, which is eroding the revenue base from Palestinian telecoms. We are currently doing a study on the cost of Area C restrictions, and this is one of the aspects that we've been tackling.
Absolutely. Okay, Professor Awartani, the microphone is yours.